Man, I'm one of those guys who I see everything in life. Now that I'm a wrestler and have learned the wrestling mentality, I see everything through wrestling eyes. So even the Montreal screw job, I guarantee you, you don't know a tenth of the truth.
Right.
You know, even with Brett coming out and saying it, how much of that is bull? You just don't know. And I
don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. Everybody's out of work or scared of losing their job. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. Punks are running wild in the street, and there's nobody anywhere who seems to know what to do, and there's no end to it. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. The air is unfit to breathe, and our food is unfit to eat. I don't want you to protest. I don't want you to riot. I don't want you to write to your congressman because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the Russians and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. My life has value.
You're listening to Toward Anarchy on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Here's your host, Michael Storm.
And here we go off into hour number 2, towardanarchy.com to follow along. If you're looking for the specific episode, you will be looking for 2603. That's the one. And, you know, if you haven't broken the code yet, since I changed the numbering system, it's the third episode of 2026. I know it's really tough. 2603 be the episode you're looking for. When you get there, you'll see that Daryl Peterson is my guest. I've been telling you about it for the last hour that he was coming up, so it shouldn't be any surprise to you. But yeah, he's here. And it's time to chat, and I'm excited about this. This is really cool because we've already had a conversation, but we had a conversation with a whole bunch of other people involved. Not that any of you out there had missed this show, like a special episode or something like that, and it blew past you. No, we were on another show together. Yeah, and it was great. We had a great time chatting and talking about the various things that we were talking about, but I thought, I'm always talking about the political stuff. You can't help but do it. If nothing else, I'm trying to tell you, hey, they're lying to you once again, and that this is, this thing that's going on right here shouldn't look like this. This is how they're painting a thing, or, there's always some political or social thing in the news that's going on right now that we can be chatting about. But that stuff, it starts to get on you. It starts to weigh on you after a little while. And I do too much of it. And I don't do as much of it as a whole lot of other people. And I have a better mental health conditioning about it, and so it doesn't weigh as heavily on me as it does on other people. I let it kind of roll like water off a duck's back, that kind of thing, right? But others do not, and so it's always nice to just take a break and not even really talk about any of those other things. If we go there, we go there. If we end up talking about something that's going on, it's almost impossible not to if you're talking to a real person who's aware of what's going on in the world and the place that he lives. I don't know how you couldn't. But generally, I thought it would be nice to come in and talk about entertainment and fun and maybe some wrestling history, something that you guys know that I'm a wrestling fan. I've talked about it for years, going all the way back to the original iteration of the show years ago across the network. And, you just know I'm a wrestling fan. I've been all my life. And so it's fun to get a chance to bring in a real wrestling superstar, and we can qualify that, and some people may want to, but get that ground view of things, because I already have a ground view of a whole lot of the world, rock and roll and movie and television and radio and all of these different things, and just sort of backstage and that, but never backstage wrestling. Always been a spectator, always been someone who enjoys the sport, if you will, and the theater of it all. That was what was more important to me. It's the story, it's the presentation, it's am I willing to go along with being put on? And everybody knows, like the screw job. Everybody knows the story of the screw job. And if you don't know the story of the screw job, you're the guy that doesn't. And so but that's one of those stories that's talking about this sort of a tier of wrestling that is only like a small percentage of what's going on. Wrestling is a huge sport. Professional wrestling is a huge sport. It's done worldwide. It puts more asses in the seats in a year than the NFL does. And it's far more of a physical sport than most things that we call sports. And yeah, there's predetermined outcomes, and there's all of this that goes along with it. But that's part of turning your if you turn on your TV and you think that anything on the other side of it is real, there may be something wrong with you. Yeah, it's all a put on. Even the stuff that claims it's real, it's all a put on. There's something going on, and my guest Daryl Peterson can tell us about the put on, and he can tell us about the wrestling, and he can tell us about some other aspects of some things that I like too. Music industry and engineering and producing sound, and I would love to probably get into some of the things that are really concerning with music today. As somebody who's been in there, and you've been in some great places, Daryl, music today is changing so much. Give me just a second. I want to set this forward, because I think this is extremely important, because I don't think people realize that this is a really true thing. So when people say like pop music all sounds the same, these artists sound the same, this has always been true. This has always been a thing, but it's even more true now because of gatekeeping, because of the reduced number of people that are able to make it into popular status, and the reduced number of people who are producing the music and doing all of the work, the background work, all that important stuff that needs to be done to actually produce an album, other than just somebody write some songs and start playing an instrument. And so there's all of these things that contribute to this sound, but they've kind of funneled down over the years. And so now when you say somebody sounds, or a sound is, there's a particular music or artist or whatever sounds the same as somebody else, you could really be saying that they literally sound the same as somebody else, because they use the same equipment, they use the same producer, they use the same writers. There's 11 writers on one song. And so literally what we're getting now in the music industry is a reduction of real music produced by individuals, and a lot of it is reproduced. And I'm not even talking about AI. I'm talking about people in a studio using pieces of equipment that are the same pieces of equipment, or the same producers or whatever of other artists, using the same sounds, using the same drum beats, using the same machines. So they're literally the same thing, because they don't change like music used to, where you go in and you record a couple of guys live playing an actual band of people playing some instruments. There are all of these things that are involved in there. There's air, and there's different types of microphones, and there's microphone position, and there's how cold it is, how warm it is, what the shape of the room is. There's all of these things that contribute to these sounds and make it so that they're all different, let alone every single individual note that's different than the last one, and played a little bit harder, played a little bit softer, played a little bit faster, played a little bit offbeat, whatever it is. All of those things are being reduced. Even the ones that are being produced in a studio are being reduced to digital productions of them. And so while even if they recorded it, sort of naturally, they bring it into a machine and they compress it, and they do all of this stuff to it that evens it out and makes it the same across it, with the same level of sound, the same speed of the beat, and all this, and it makes it very homogenous, and that's what we get today. And that was a very long way to lead us maybe into some of the other things that you do, Daryl. But you're a wrestler. Tell me tell me a little bit about yourself and some wrestling and how it is that you are here after all these years doing what you do. And was wrestling like a big thing for you? Did you want to do that? Was that something that you grew up, because I immediately think of who Mike the Miz is, right? Of course, everybody does, right? Current, well, I guess I don't know if he's still wrestling or not. He's been a champion, and the only reason I bring him up is because he was on Road Rules and MTV years and years ago. And he was just a kid, and he said, I'm going to be a wrestling superstar. He said, that's what I want to do. He knew all the way back then, and by golly, he did it. He pulled it off. Is that you and you in wrestling?
Well, first of all, Michael, it's funny because you've been calling me Daryl, and it's funny because from the time I can remember, literally, I remember the first time I told my mom that I hated my name. And she said, what? I mean, she started crying, because she'd worked hard to give me the name Daryl Peterson. And I'm like, I remember all of the circumstances surrounding, that moment when I realized that I wasn't Daryl Peterson, that there was a different character that I always wanted to be. And so she goes, well, what would you choose your name to be? And I said, well, I don't know, but when I figure it out, I'll tell you, I'll have arrived. And so please call me Max, because Daryl, it's fine. I'm not embarrassed by it.
No, I get you.
I haven't been, nobody that currently knows me calls me Daryl.
Fair enough.
My parents have all passed. My brothers have all passed. All the people in my life that used to call me Daryl, regardless of my history, most of them are gone now. And so all the people that are currently in my life call me Max. Anyway.
Fair enough. I absolutely know how that is as a longtime radio guy. Right. I use a name that is suitable for radio, and it's not my real name. And that's what people know me as. I've literally been known, just like you, as Michael Storm longer than I've been known by my real name. Period.
Yeah,
that's all there is to it. Yeah.
You,
so no, I get you, Max. So Maxx Payne, the wrestler, the wrestler. You're one of the hard workers, right? You're one of the guys that makes it happen every single day. That was your role coming up. You're not necessarily that small percentage of those guys that get all the attention, that get the TV shows and all that. You're that guy that's doing the wrestling every single night. That's how you're making your money. You're making your bones, because you're wrestling every single night, and you're wrestling, you're on the road. You're old school, even when old school wasn't even necessarily a thing in your time anymore, right?
Well, the funny part about it is I'm proud of the way I broke into the wrestling business.
I would hope so, yeah.
I broke in the hard way. I started carrying jackets back and forth and building the ring, and I built the cage for King Kong Bundy and Hulk Hogan in WrestleMania 2. It's pretty well documented. I've talked about it over and over again. Actually, if you watch WrestleMania 2, you can see me putting the cage together with my nephew and the other guys that was there. I was the guy who oversaw that moment. But the only reason I'm proud of that is because I was a nobody behind the scenes in the beginning. I started at the bottom, and then I was lucky enough to go to Japan. The guy who trained me, a guy named Red Bastine, got me booked in Japan for my very first gig. And so I lived in Japan almost a full year the first time I went there, and then on and off for a year and a half. And I spent, I worked really, really hard to become a professional wrestler and to learn the business from the bottom up. Because that's kind of who I am. I mean, I did the amateur wrestling world the same kind of way. And so, wrestling to me it was all of my life. for 25 years. It's all I did, all I thought about, all I dreamed of. And in the end, I was blackballed. I was a wrestling anarchist. I love throwing screwdrivers in the wheel, and I pissed a lot of people off, and I'm not afraid to say that. And because it's just, if I didn't say that, I'd be lying. But I'd rather go to my grave having stood up for what I believed in and what I truly was than be full of one of the guys that's, full of shit and, has to lie about their career and their beginnings because they didn't pay their dues or whatever.
Because they didn't pay their dues, yeah.
You can't bullshit your way around paying your dues. There's it's one of those things. Now it's different. The wrestling business is,
and it was changing in the time that we're talking about, and that's why there is a disconnect from the people who were still doing the hard work like yourself, that were making their bones, making it happen for everybody else so you could make it happen for yourself, whereas there were other guys that were just appearing all of a sudden with a certain look or a certain style or something like that were getting the bump right to the top because they had the right connection or the right name or whatever it happened to be.
Well, luckily though, what's great about this is the guy who taught me the business taught me that you can't worry about that. I learned early on that if I was going to sit around and be pissed off about the people who were going past me because a promoter, wanted, other things from them rather than just to be a wrestler, and that got them higher on the card than you'd spend your life as a wrestler being miserable. And so I never, like I said, all I could do is what I did. I was honest about who I was. I made tons of mistakes myself. I'm far from perfect. I learned a lot from the wrestling business, and it's funny because it's such a, I still believe I have PTSD from it because I was so blackballed. I was so removed. I'm still removed from the wrestling business. All the things that I believe I could have brought to the table, I never got an opportunity to give to the wrestling business, and that's okay. Because once again, I had to learn myself. You can't force yourself into a situation like that. You do the best you can. You hope that things fall in your direction. I had some great moments. I made it to the show. I had a run. It didn't work out. I tried everything, and that's just the way life is. And I don't regret it. I live in Idaho. I'm married to a beautiful woman who I love, and will spend the rest of my life with. And I'm a real lucky guy. I've been all over the world. I've made money all over the world. I've traveled to, countries. I've lived in every country, and all the things I've ever wanted to do in my life, I got to do because of wrestling. And, on top of the music, even though, I battled to try and bring my musical side to the wrestling business, they just didn't want it. And I tried my ass off to bring that forth, but the wrestling business just didn't want that part of what I brought to the table. And so
that's so weird because they're so tied together. They've been so tied, and still to this day, they're very specific, and even there are certain artists that make their bones doing music for professional wrestling. There's one I can think of in particular that you wouldn't know who they were if you hadn't heard them, doing the intro for wrestling for somebody. I think, so yeah, they've always been connected. I can just, Honky Tonk Man for, just anybody like that. Thinking back even to those days and that was everywhere. There was always somebody trying to do, throw the guitar in there or rock out to a new music, walking down the aisle.
Yet when they had it, Michael, that's the funny part about it. Yet when they had that guy, which was me, I was legitimately the real deal. I could play and I could wrestle, and I could actually fucking go out there and rock. And the entire time I was in the WCW, I only played in front of a crowd twice, in front of the WCW live, and in the WWF. Luckily, on my last tour, because of a grave injury to the guy I was wrestling in Europe on the tour, they let me play like 6 times in Europe. But having said that, they just, man, I met total opposition at every, like, for example, let's just use the WWF, for example. When I went there, they had a music guy named Jim Johnston, and Jim Johnston was responsible for all of the WWF's music. And they made it clear to me that they weren't going to let me play and write my own ring music. They made it clear to me that he was going to be the one to do the shit that he did. I hated it. It's what killed my gimmick, and in my opinion, Mick Foley said they defrocked me, and that's one of the ways that they did defrock me, is they took away everything that I was capable of. But you know, how do I say they did it maliciously? I can't. All I can say is, for whatever reason, they didn't like what Maxx Payne brought to the table, and I can't fault them for that. All I can do is try to move forward. And now this movie, the great thing about it is I produced a movie on my last tour in the World Wrestling Federation, and it's finally going to come out. And people, the great thing about videotape is it doesn't lie. So you're going to get to see for yourself the reaction of crowds in Europe and how they reacted to my guitar playing, and how I was treated in the WWF behind the scenes, because the guys that were on tour pull no punches. The Clique at the time pull no punches with how much they hated me. And, you know, it's just one of those moments in time where, you know, that's who I was. And maybe that was it wasn't maybe, that was my destiny. It was my destiny to not, you know, have that run in the sun, because for whatever reason, the powers that be, just at every level that I could fail and that things could go wrong, they did. For example, I was working with the rock star Steve Miller, who was going to be a part of my show. He pulled out on me in the last minute. So, I've talked about this stuff over and over again. It's out there if you want to go discover it. But, you know, I'm not bitter. I'm just sad, because I believed in myself. I still believe in myself to this day, or I would have stuck a gun in my mouth a long time ago. You know, the differences between me and the other people that the WWF has railroaded and blackballed is most of them ended up taking their lives because they couldn't stand the rejection. Well, it's fucking hard. It hurts, and it hurts bad. But I got enough of an ego that I'll be damned if I'm going to let them force me to stick a gun in my mouth or to take my own life. I'm just not that guy, and I'm not afraid any longer. You know, it's one of those moments in time where I got nothing to lose. I am who I am. You either like me or you don't. There's not a damn thing I can do about it. And we'll let the videotape that's coming out in the future speak for itself. And like you were talking about earlier, you know, I taught myself how to be an audio engineer. I probably have 2 PhDs in audio engineering that I taught myself, because that's who I am. When I dive into something, I figure out how do I go and learn that at a ground level, just like I did wrestling. I did the same thing with audio engineering. I ended up working for a company that made microphone preamplifiers and equalizers, world-class equalizers and microphone preamplifiers. So I ended up at all of the major trade shows for audio, taught myself how to be an audio engineer, taught myself Pro Tools, built my own recording studios. My very first recording studio I bought in 1993 in the WCW. It was called an Alesis Dream Studio. It was the first digital studio filled with ADATs, Neumann microphones, Summit microphone preamplifiers, the best equipment I could buy. And I recorded an album in Atlanta, brought a whole bunch of great musicians together and recorded this album. And that's who I am. So I'm not going to be ashamed of the things I did. You know, I had a friend say to me one time, Max, you can't serve two masters. Well, I think I could have if I would have been supported by the people that were behind me going, wow, we see the potential in this, but no one in the wrestling business ever, I mean, even Vince, he saw it, but he let the powers that be say, yeah, Max is a piece of shit, so let's not do nothing with him. And you know what? That's, like I said, how do I change that? Well, I can't. I can't change history. I can't change time. So all I can do is continue, you know, like this, when this movie comes out and I let the things come out that represent who I am. Because the funny part about my movie is I wrote the soundtrack for the movie I made in the WWF when I was in the WCW before I went to the WWF. So the soundtrack that's going to be on the movie that's coming out, I wrote when I was in the WCW because I knew, I don't know how I knew it, but I knew I was going to make this movie because I'm like you. You know, when you were talking about behind the scenes, that's the shit I always believe. It's funny you brought up Road Rules because that's what gave me the idea for this movie that I made, was because I always believed what was cool about the wrestling business was the shit behind the curtain. And nobody ever got to see that because of kayfabe, and everybody was trying to be silent about it. Well, it's not that way anymore. There's this new WWF series called Unreal, and it completely exposes and did what I did 30 years ago. And when this finally comes out, people will see for themselves that I'm not full of shit. I'm not just blowing hot air. I actually created that mentality 30 years ago, but the wrestling business was not even close to being ready for that. They were still so deep into kayfabe and keeping everybody in the dark. And, oh, my God, you got to protect the business. I never believed that. I always believed the only way for the wrestling business to go to the next level was to completely expose it and to give everybody the opportunity to go, okay, this is just like a movie. It's willing suspense of disbelief. I'm going to walk into the fucking arena. I'm going to put my hands on the handrails the handrails of the seat I'm sitting in, and I'm going to go, okay, I'm going to willingly suspend my disbelief, and you own me for the next 2 hours. And that way, the wrestling business can do anything, and you don't have to try and lie about it. You don't have to try and convince somebody that it's real, because it is real. It's painful. It's deteriorating. It's hell on your body. It's hell life on the road. And all of those things exist. But I was just that guy that, you know what, man, I don't want to sound like I'm too far ahead of my time. I'll let my own work speak for itself, because everything else is just pompous and arrogant. I'll just let people see the truth for themselves. And when the thing that should not be comes out, that's the name of the movie. When it comes out, people can make their own decisions about who I am and what I was, because it doesn't lie. It's pretty cutting, and you know, honestly, it paints a pretty tough picture. So, in a lot of ways, that's who I am.
Well, that's amazing. I think it's probably long overdue. I think you're probably right. Being somebody who myself, you know, back as a young child, ultimately watching WWF, and then ultimately WCW and all the following iterations of all of those things. And even before that, even before really, there was regional wrestling and some things like that. And I was so young that I didn't know what it was. My grandfather and my uncles, they watched it.
Where'd you grow up, Michael? Where'd you grow up?
In Colorado.
Oh, so you were the guy. You were one of the guys like me. I grew up in Utah, so Rocky Mountain Wrestling was the regional. Was that the same wrestling? And probably the AWA is probably the group of guys you saw when you were.
Yeah, probably mostly AWA. Yeah,
right.
That would be my guess. Yeah, I was pretty young at the time, and you know, because I'm old enough that I've been around for all the WrestleManias, and you know, I knew wrestling by the time there was a thing called WrestleMania. I already knew who all those people were. You know, WrestleMania set the rest of the world on fire for wrestling. There was all of us other guys who'd been along for the ride for, you know, however long, and obviously long before I came along. Because it was, you know, all over the nation in different places, all the different little areas, and Vince's father back before Vince, and yeah, it goes back. There's a history for sure, and so, but I knew as a young kid watching it that what I was watching was theater, that what I was watching was performance by people that were, you know, stood to get seriously hurt if they didn't perform really well, ultimately. And so I never had any delusion about it, and I was never, you know, I never turned on the TV and thought, oh my gosh, you know, that they just beat that poor guy down, or whatever, you know, whatever it is, whatever presentation they're putting on, that it's a performance piece. I didn't have to concern myself whether it was real or not, that I was just supposed to be entertained, and that's me. With all of this stuff, you know, I'm a comic book guy, I'm a pop culture guy, I own a comic book shop, and I just watched a bunch of new movies this weekend. I'm just catching up on a bunch of stuff that hit streaming and things like that. I just want to be entertained. I don't care what it is. You do an X-Men movie for me. I know it's not going to be the X-Men movie that I want. You put on a wrestling match for me. It's not going to be the wrestling match I want. It's going to be the wrestling match that whoever the hell is making these things puts on. And I'm either going to be entertained or I'm not going to be entertained. And this is a world where I call myself the bad fan, because I can tell you about all these things in very minimal terms, yet I enjoy them so much and enjoy them. You know, I can't tell you the history of all of these things. Was it the Montreal screw job? I know it was. Yeah. Is it Montreal? See, I couldn't even. I wasn't even.
Probably the most famous screw job.
Sure, yeah, absolutely, because it's where they took the title away. Ultimately, they would. It should have gone to Bret Hitman Hart, and ultimately things got turned over to Hogan. And
but then again, what's really amazing about this? Okay, so this is where I get a lot. This is who I am that pisses everybody off. This is where I'm like you, is because, man, I'm one of those guys who I see everything in life. Now that I'm a wrestler and have learned the wrestling mentality, I see everything through wrestling eyes. So even the Montreal screw job, I guarantee you, you don't know a tenth of the truth.
Right.
You know, even with Bret coming out and saying it, how much of that is bull? You just don't know. And I've said this about the NFL. You know, one of the things about the NFL is the NFL has the third man itself. They have the referees. They have the ability to change plays, and we see it happen all the time. Sometimes you'll be watching a replay and they will change something and you will think to yourself, wow, did I not just watch the same thing that those guys watched and change it out completely for something different? And it always blows me away. There's always politics. When Donald Trump first came out, I used to say I believed with all of my heart that he had Vince McMahon on speed dial because he had been a wrestler. They were tied together for years, for decades. Right. I mean, he was in WrestleMania 7, for God's sake. You know, the guy understands the wrestling business. And Roger Stone, the guy who ran Donald's first campaign, oh my God, I've heard him talk. He's on steroids. The guy lives and breathes professional wrestling. Linda McMahon is still in the Trump organization to this day, and I'm telling you, I just saw a video just the other day with Triple H standing in the White House, and so all of a sudden, all the things I said, I had a show called The Pain Lair back in 2016, and I was calling all of this out, and now it's just commonplace to see wrestlers, to see Triple H associated with Donald Trump. To me, it speaks volumes of the principles that are happening behind the scenes in the government of the United States.
Well, you have to know, no matter what you know about Trump, you have to know that there's a show going on, that it's all about performance for him, that it's all about
eyeballs,
perception.
man. How do I get eyeballs?
Yeah.
And that's the thing about wrestling. There's only one, there's really, the funny part about wrestling, in the end, there's only one reason for wrestling, is eyeballs. And if you ever forget that, you're really missing out. And the truth of the matter is if you realize and understand the true power origin of wrestling. So wrestling as a history started with the beginning of television. The reason wrestling is so powerful in America still to this day is because when television first came out, they didn't have anything else to put on television, and they had wrestling on all the time because it was programming, and they didn't have programming when television first started. And wrestling was an easy thing to put on television. And so from the very inception of television in this country, wrestling was a part of it. And one other thing real quickly, Michael, I want to say this, is most people don't realize the impact of wrestling in the world for not decades, not centuries, for millennia. The Greek Empire, and I know this for a fact because I studied it in college, the Greek Empire and the whole Troy, the Trojan horse, and all of the warring between the Greek cities and all of that was all because of professionalism of athletics. And the primary professionalism of athletics back in those days was wrestling. And what would happen is the cities were paying each other's biggest wrestling fan, their biggest wrestling stars, they were paying them off to do jobs so that they could, there was money and politics involved. And what was the premier event at all the Olympics starting in 726 BC? I know this for a fact. Wrestling was the premier event in the Olympics. They wrestled naked. They smeared themselves with olive oil. Then they threw sand on each other. They wrestled the best 2 out of 3 falls. And then after each fall, they would scrape themselves off with an instrument called a strigil. And they'd scrape the sand off. They'd put more oil on. They'd put more sand on each other, and they'd go for fall number 2. And that got corrupt. And Plato warned. He warned civilization. He said, if the professional of athletics overrules the knowledge of the athletes, when athletes aren't well-rounded to the point where they understand all of the critical things of critical thinking, where all they care about is athletics, it will be the fall of Greek civilization. And he was profound, and he was right.
Interesting. Well, it's interesting because back then, makes sense. It kind of seems like you could fall off because there wasn't a solid base for education, for one thing, so that people could be more multidimensional than they would be. You would expect somebody who was strong to just be strong, not necessarily be smart. but obviously they're, their own renaissance at that time itself. And so people are, smarter and more educated and there are more opportunities. But today, that's something that is demanded of a true athlete today. You can play around in sports all you want, but to be a sort of professional athlete and to get out there in the big show, it doesn't matter what sport. It doesn't matter. You have to be more than just a beast. Even the biggest beasts have to be more than just a beast. They have to be smart. And you know how that used to be shown was, well, if the beast wasn't big enough, wasn't smart enough, he had a manager, and that was always one of my favorite aspects of wrestling, and was the manager. That's something that's gone away these days. It doesn't exist anymore. You really don't have the manager character in there. I think Paul Bearer was probably the last really good one. But yeah, the Jimmy Harts and the Bobby Heenans and these guys that weren't themselves wrestlers, but were as big, if not if not bigger than most of the wrestlers that they stood next to when when the camera came on. Yeah, everybody wanted to see the wrestler, but what's Jimmy going to say? What's Bobby going to say? What's he going to? Is he going to slap one of those big bastards?
Is he going to trip the baby face and cause the baby face to lose the match? And everybody in the arena sees it, but not the referee. And all of those conventions that go with having a manager, with having a referee not see. I mean, all of those things that make wrestling. All those conventions, to me, is, now wrestling, I'm going to say this. I'm going to say something that's going to sound ridiculous, but I believe this with all my heart. And I've said it for years, for decades, I've said this. Wrestling, professional wrestling, because amateur wrestling's been in the Olympics since its inception.
Yeah.
But professional wrestling has as much place in the Olympics as does amateur wrestling, and here's why. No one questions for a second when you watch an ice skating performance that every fucking single element of that ice skating performance, including even the finger movements of and how they move their hands, it's all choreographed from beginning to end. And what are they judged on? They're judged on how well they convince you that what they're doing is natural and believable. And I believe that professional wrestling, somebody will have the balls to have the courage to put professional wrestling in clubs in schools, and you will be judged. People will go out and the baby faces and the heels will come out, and they will be judged on, were they a believable heel? Were they a believable baby face? Did they perform the conventions? Because believe it or not, there are a lot. There's a high spot called the international that every wrestler has to know that, because you just get in the ring and somebody says an international, everybody knows what that high spot is. And those are the conventions that once you've given wrestling sort of that flavor, now you can sit down and watch it and hold up a number card and a rating and go, oh yeah, that was a 7. It can now be looked at like you're watching a ice skating performance, or you're watching a ballet performance, or whatever. I think the future of professional wrestling at a high school level, if we really want wrestling to continue to grow, it now has to be involved in culture in a way that it's never been, because it's spent so long trying to hide itself in kayfabe.
Well, and then there's no natural channel anymore, really.
Right. Exactly.
Right. It's all kind of manipulated now. And so, yeah, you have to go all the way to the source, all the way back to the beginning to find. Well, I think everybody's having that problem right now. As a comic book guy, comic books are that way because there's diminishing it. It's, there's still interest. There's still plenty of people showing up and buying the comic books. There's still plenty of people getting there in the seats and watching the shows, but attentions are going away and things are taking their attention away. And you have to have a very specific plan for the future to continue to keep your industry and things alive. And in the past, you know this better than anyone, I'm sure, it's been gatekeeping. It's been pretending like what you're doing is the best thing for the industry, no matter what anybody else thinks. And we have the same problem with the movie industry. We have the same problem with the music industry. They all fall into this same pattern where they get to gatekeeping each other and they don't have a path for developing new talent to push to that top tier percentage to keep the bigger crowd coming in and looking at things. So yeah.
You know what I think it is, man. To me, what it is, and my wife and I sit and laugh about this all the time, is there's never. It's just like music. It's like you were talking about with music. Part of the reason that when I was a kid that I loved music so much is the innovation that was happening in the early 70s, the late 60s and early 70s. Man, when Kiss came out, there was nothing like Kiss. There was nothing even close to Kiss, and yet there were bands that had similar traits. But nothing is a package as complete as Kiss. Yep. When the band...
And there probably never will be again.
Right, and there never will be, and there shouldn't be. That's, to me, the problem with all of this is how do you stay... Like, comic books is a classic example. How do you stay innovative in a world... Music's the exact same thing. Politics, the exact same thing.
Well, and that's why the big guys are failing. That's why the big guys are failing, because they don't have that bigger vision. They have that corporate vision. They have that dollar vision. They have this thing makes money, so stick with it. And they're very dumb about trying to farm the new talent. That was what I was getting at, is that ultimately you have to farm this new talent, right? Like we were talking about. Well, the comic book industry fails to do it itself. Because those big guys aren't bringing in the groups, the larger groups of people and talent to create other things. It's narrowed to, it's got to be Iron Man, it's got to be Spider-Man, it's got to be Batman, it's got to be. They don't do proper anthology books anymore. None of these things came out of their own thing. Nobody just started the title right away. All of those original superheroes, all of those creations all came from group work and group collections and Superman himself was only like 4-6 pages of the first Action Comics, and for that matter, Action Comics number 2, 3, and 4. It's only sort of 6 pages or whatever. And when they went to Superman number 1, it was just a collection of Action Comics 1, 2, 3, and 4, the parts where he was in them. And then, but then there's the others. There's the others that are happening around the same time and going on at the same time. And you're farming new stories and you're getting new things out of them because they're not as, maybe not as gate kept. And so Batman happens, and Batman comes out of this anthology book, and he's not even the first anthology book. He's like the 27th one. It's the 27th issue of this book, and all of a sudden this character comes out of it, and this character is so much more powerful than the issue 1 Action Comics Superman, in the proof that when they do the same thing that they did with Superman, they go to the Batman issue number 1, all new stories. Much more powerful character, and they learned something from that about farming new ideas. They learned something from that, and they've struggled with it all these years in the back and forth in why one character is better than another. Well, it's because of the freedom that you give that character to be creative. Superman is kind of in a box. He's really a very limited, very narrow scope of an idea, and you can't really go outside of it or you diminish what he is. Batman, on the other hand, is just a dude with some money and a bad attitude, right? So you can work with that a lot more than you can work with the clay of alien from another planet, stronger than everybody else.
You know, man, you and I need to talk more extensively. I have a comic book hero that my son and I developed years ago, and I always believed he would be great. We'll talk more about it, but part of the reason is, so to me, you know, my favorite example of this is moments that changed the world. How were they different, and why did they so catch on? And one of my favorite examples is the band Nirvana and what they did to change rock and roll. I mean, here's a band in the middle of everything was exactly what we're talking about. The slickest productions, the record companies taking complete control over everything. The bands were all perfect. They looked perfect. Their hair was perfect. They had all the great guitar players. Everything was perfect. And yet people were bored senseless. And what did it take to change that? A bunch of kids who were, you know, didn't wear deodorant and wore flannel shirts from Seattle playing some nouveau punk that come about and completely and utterly changed the rock and roll world by throwing in this mix of this consortium of all this different style of music, yet coming up with something incredibly original that it felt familiar, but it felt completely new.
I hate to be the guy that just goes to that space, but it's Gen X. That's all there is to it. It's Gen X and the fringe from the previous generation, because it's the same thing happens in comic books at almost exactly the same time. Everybody looks at Marvel and superheroes and the way the industry is run and all the gatekeeping and all this, you know, it has to be these characters and it can't be anything else. And we're talking about an industry that literally until just about 2 years ago, that the two biggest players owned the word superhero, the phrase superhero, and it copyrighted it, so other people couldn't use it as an example of the gatekeeping. And so what happened? You know, half of the people that worked at Marvel all up and quit and started their own company, and now it's the other big company in comic books, and has been for a long time.
See, that's it. So what? And so then the other side of that is like we were talking about the music industry. Well, the music industry is so boring because it's right back to where it was before Nirvana. It's the same predictable formula shite that the music companies, and yet here's the sad part. Never in the history of the recording industry has it been so easy for people with talent to record high quality recordings.
Just like we were talking about just the podcast thing and how easy it is. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You can do it yourself and you can do it really well. Yet everybody just wants to imitate everything that's gone on previously and try to just do it enough that you become a star and you got 1 million viewers and you're getting your YouTube money, and you know that it's all based on that. There's nobody out there with just the balls to say, it, I'm just going to be this crazy guy that does exactly what I feel in my heart. It has nothing to do with Marvel Comics, with Columbia Records, with, you know, 21st Century Fox. I mean, that's what's wrong with the movie industry. It's just the same story with a different package. Nothing.
And that's problematic of all life, right? It's all art, because all of these things should be reflecting human experience, and human experience is pretty well limited. We're pretty simple creatures. We all really want and understand the same things, at least the normal ones of us, whatever the hell that means. And so it's very easy to tell those stories. The trick is to tell them in such a way that they feel new, that it looks like something different than it is, because obviously it's not going to be. There's nothing that we understand outside of human understanding. So the only other thing could be some wild acid trip, and that stuff happened in the 60s. That was what underground comics was. That was what disco was. That was what all those things were. And they had their place, and they were colorful, and they were fine, and they did all that stuff at the time. But it didn't last. It wasn't the powerful. It wasn't it was the pop. It was the pomp and circumstance. It was what was popular at the time, and what's popular isn't always necessarily what's good and what's going to last. And one of the things that we get today is, because of the fact that we have the, instead of YouTubes and the streaming and everybody can do it, is that everybody does do it. And so there's a watered down presentation. And even from the ones who do it well, they're not very smart. They'll be really super smart in a lot of ways, and then they'll fail in one particular way or another that's entirely detrimental to what they're trying to prove. And especially when you're talking about what I opened the show with, the whole idea that things are so electronic and so easily mass produced from one artist to another, and it sound the same. So if you're one of these artists that you're using backbeats, you're using 808s, you're using some loops of somebody else's music, something like that, you have to remember that that's what you're doing. And so when you come and you tell Spotify, I'm not speaking of any artists in particular, when you tell Spotify or whoever out there that they can't produce or have a certain type of music on their platform, and you're not going to be on that platform, well, their argument is that it's not real music, that it wasn't produced by a person or whatever. I get that argument, but brother, you don't have a drummer. Your drummer is named 808. So when you're talking about digitally produced music, when you're talking about things that are from a machine and from maybe one artist's creation and one artist's inception, and he's the one that pushes all the button, it doesn't make it any better or any worse. It just makes it what it is. And again, just like what you were talking about with the wrestling, if you're going to spend your time worried about what the other guys are doing, how are you ever going to concentrate on what you're doing and work on you? Brother, we got like 2 minutes.
That's so true. Life, and then, so let me segue and end the whole thing with this. What we should be afraid, I want to say this because I mean this from the bottom of my heart. What we should be afraid of with AI is AI replacing us as human beings, because we have not, everything's been done. And it's happening in the world right now, the destruction of our planet, the ignorance that we all have towards climate change and ignoring what's going on. We're about to create sentient beings, and human beings are about to create eternal life. And I got to tell you, man, nobody thinks about it that way. And there's a guy named Isaac Asimov who put forth 3 laws of robotics that nobody's even talking about when it comes to AI. And part of the danger of the future and AI is when we can complete our mission of creating a new sentient being, a life form that's not biological, that can live forever, that can go from body to body to body.
That's the thing, yeah. From electronic body to electronic body.
We have to be aware that all of a sudden we can be replaced.
Yeah. Well, and I just want to do, because as a music producer and a movie producer, somebody like yourself who's in there using these tools and things, the AI that I use to do code, that I use to produce music, that I use are just variations of digital tools and things that we've been using all along. These aren't AI isn't a monolith. It's not, there's just one thing called AI. There's a whole bunch of different tools and things out there that fall under this category of AI. And so what I want people to understand is there's a difference between tools that help people do a job and make things easier and sort of eliminate costs and middlemen and stuff like that is perfectly fine. A controlled system of information and knowledge, centrally controlled by a bunch of billionaires and politicians and scumbags, isn't probably a good idea. Brother, it's been so great talking to you. Maxx Payne, we will do it again, my friend. The rest of you, I got to let you go, and we'll catch up with you again next week.
Two peas in a pod. All voters are the same. Simple-minded fools who think their vote makes a difference. The system's broke, Hank. The election baby has peed in the bathwater. You got to throw them both out.
You're listening to Toward Anarchy on the Republic Broadcasting Network.